one more time. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Queer and AI panel. It's going to be a really fun time. Quick introductions. My name is Julia. I'm a fourth year CS major, and I'm with ACM-W here at UCLA. And Nisha.
Yeah, hey, I am your other moderator. My name is Nisha, she, her pronouns, and I am a second year CS major, part of ACM-AI.
Cool.
All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. But before we do, we at ACM know that there's always room for improvement. So we wanted to read a quick statement on intersectionality. So as some have said, trans and non-binary people have gotten the short end of the stick in the queer and trans rights movement. This is particularly prevalent in STEM and also applies to individuals with disabilities and people of color, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous individuals in the LGBTQIA+ community. We at ACM-W and ACM-AI want to emphasize that while this panel is highlighting queer individuals in AI, the LGBTQIA+ community is so large, diverse, and multifaceted, and people from different races, abilities, gender identities, and backgrounds face different struggles. We and everyone else have a long way to go in giving specific subgroups of the community the attention they deserve. There's no true LGBTQIA+ rights movement without an emphasis on intersectionality, and we are always trying to improve. All right, so with that said, we are going to jump into our panelist introductions. We are super excited to have three awesome panelists here today. And so we would love to just go around and hear everybody's name, pronouns, your occupation, and a little bit about your story, like how you came to work in AI. And just to keep things simple, we're going to go in a set order. So Arjun will go first, and then Siddharth, and then Mary-Lena.
Hey, awesome. Hi, everyone. So my name is Arjun, pronouns they, them, and I am actually a senior at UCLA, so I'm just about to graduate from the computer science program here. I want to say, like, I'll start off with some stuff around like what I do at UCLA. So I know Nisha, Maya, Julia, all these wonderful people really well because I do outreach at ACM-AI. We help organize a high school course that emphasizes machine learning and fairness, ethics, those kinds of things in the greater LA area at underserved schools. I also organize Queer Hacks at UCLA, which is like the first collegiate LGBTQIA+ hackathon. And outside of that, some of the research work that I do, I really am passionate about graph representation learning. I think it has really amazing applications to learning representations for molecules, which can then aid us in doing drug discovery. So rather than doing these costly lab experiments to discover like properties of molecules, we can use machine learning to predict what properties they might have, and that'll help scientists make drugs a lot faster. I'm also really interested in fairness, so learning like fair graph embeddings. I'm also really interested in the intersection of queer theory and AI. So I like resistance AI, a lot of these other movements within artificial intelligence, looking at how queer and trans individuals are represented in human-centered AI systems.
All right, so my name is Siddharth Garg. I'm a professor of computer engineering at NYU in New York City. My pronouns are he, him. I grew up in India in a time, and I guess it's still true, in a time when being queer in India was really not something that anyone ever spoke about, and especially being queer in technology, in computer science and engineering was just not something that was even heard of. I moved to the US in 2004. I've lived in various parts of this country, starting in the Bay Area and then Pittsburgh and now New York. And my work is, I started out actually doing computer hardware design. And over the past few years, I've really found myself drifting into core machine learning research. So I do a lot of work in designing robust and trustworthy machine learning systems. And increasingly, I'm beginning to look at designing fair AI systems, as Arjun pointed out as well. And we do a bunch of cool things here as well to do for outreach. So we run summer programs for high school students, especially from parts of the city where resources are less available. And more recently, I've been doing a summer, well, not a summer program, actually, a spring semester program for fifth graders trying to figure out how actually we can teach fifth graders AI. So that's been really fascinating and rewarding at the same time. And I'll hand it over to Mary Elena.
Thank you, and I want to say also thank you for allowing me the opportunity to participate in this panel. It's an honor. So my name is Mary Elena. I use any pronouns, and I am a second-year PhD student. I work at, my lab is at UT Southwestern Medical Center, the Medical Artificial Intelligence and Automation Lab out of the Division of Medical Physics. So I actually, where I guess how I got here is, so I grew up in Canada, actually, in a southern Alberta. And I straight up just like grew up hearing that like gay people were like ruining the country and, you know, going to hell and stuff like that. And so, you know, I left Canada when I was 17, came down here. I was a nun candidate for a little while. And then after I got kind of kicked out of that, I ended up doing music for a while as well. And then junior year of my undergraduate, it was when I switched to science at about the same time as I started coming out as queer, and ended up doing, like I mentioned, now I'm a second year PhD student. I do medical physics and deep learning. And a lot of my work nowadays, so what I do is deep reinforcement learning and some physics as well for optimization of radiotherapy treatment in cancer treatment, for killing cancer tumors, basically. So that's a bit about what I do. I also have most of my background is in like statistics and mathematics, so that's my domain next area of expertise.
Thank you. That's super interesting. All of your work sounds really amazing. And I think we're going to get into our first like real question, which is pretty broad, so feel free to interpret it however you want. But the question is, what is it like identifying as queer in AI? And for this question, we're going to go with Siddharth first, then Mary Elena, and then Arjun.
So I think my experience is identifying as queer in AI. Actually, I think I used to, as I said, I worked, my work in AI has been over the last 3 years. Before that, I used to attend conferences in computer engineering and hardware design. And I felt that, you know, for example, AI has been a lot more welcoming. Some of that is a sign of the times as well, but certainly to some extent, I think NeurIPS and ICML and some of the leading conferences in AI, which I've been at, have been, you know, more welcoming and open to diverse identities, not only for queer people, but also for people of color, for example. So I really appreciate the fact that we now have queer in AI workshops. I know Arjun is affiliated with some of them. And, you know, so for the most part, I felt that the AI community has been more welcoming than other communities in computer science that I have been part of. But that doesn't mean that everything is, I don't think that we're there yet. I still feel, for example, that I'm comfortable, for example, within a smaller space, but have there been experiences where I'm uncomfortable expressing my queerness, even at otherwise reasonably diverse conferences? For sure. And I think there's a lot of work that's still left to be done.
I guess for me, I don't have any, you know, probably as useful insights as we just heard, but for me, the metaphor I always like to use is like, it's kind of like being a sort of like a secret agent to me, where like, I feel like there are a lot of people, like there are a lot of queer people in AI. They just don't often, I feel like, talk about it. So sometimes you'll find someone, you'll discover like through some happenstance that they're queer, and it's like really cool. It's like, wow, there are all these people, you know, that are like me, and you know, doing this really cool work, and you just kind of have to find them and stuff. So that's my experience, I guess.
Yeah, I actually really want to +1 retweet whatever you want to say what Mary Elena said about like visibility. I just feel like oftentimes it's just not like a lot of the other queer and trans people in AI are not very visible. Like they do exist, but just not super visible. I guess like with regards to my experience with what it means to be queer in AI, I remember like so I grew up in Cupertino, went to a high school where people were like, liberal, accepting, and like very exaggerated quotes. I hated going to physics because I was told that like, same-sex marriage was like really weird, and it would just be like those toxic tech bros sitting in a table discussing the rights of other people, like it was some kind of intellectual activity. So I remember when I came to university, or like when I came to UCLA, I joined like a small little student-led startup, and I was just so scared to mention anything about um, like my life as a queer person or my boyfriend or anything like that. It just seemed very peripheral to everything that we were doing. But slowly, as I kind of grew in my AI journey, I realized that like I wasn't someone in AI who happened to be queer. I was like a queer person in AI, and that was very central to my identity. Uh, like I think fairness work in AI is like one of the biggest indicators of this. You will be surprised by how many queer people do fairness work. It's like anyone who does fairness work is like very, very likely to be queer. And it's just so cool because we all get together and we're like, wow, human-centered AI systems made by cishet people are trash. And we really need to do something about that. Also, like my lab has been really accepting, which has been awesome. And I'm an organizer for Queer in AI, which is also great. Like it's such a supportive community. I see people I really look up to, and they're so welcoming. They want to help me with grad school apps. They want to help me like succeed long term, not just like, take me to a conference and like show me around the like all the things that they have to offer there. Although the last thing I'm going to say is sometimes I do try to remember that I'm on a different plane than a lot of the other cishet people in the AI community. Queer and AI workshops are really awesome for queer and trans people to feel supported, but you never really see a lot of straight or like cis people going to these workshops. So there was a town hall yesterday, and like sexuality was referred to as a lifestyle choice. And so that kind of like, I just kind of clicked there and I was like, oh, there are people, I'm like operating on a completely different plane from everyone else. And sometimes we need to go back and not assimilate, because that's the worst thing to do, but to like remind people that we are here, we're queer, and we're going to radically reform AI to shape it in our benefit, because it's only been hurting us so far.
Definitely, that was very well said from all three of you. Kind of going along with the idea of finding these welcoming people and groups like Queer in AI and these other secret agents. How has your support system been at school and at work? And how important have groups like Queer in AI or other communities been to you? And the order for this question will be Mary Lena, then Arjun, then Siddharth.
So I guess for me, the support system at my school, I know we have like a women's and LGBT center, but for one reason or another, I was never super involved with that. However, I do know there are a couple other queer people in my program, which is really nice, and they were like my superiors in terms of seniority. So that was just really cool to see. As for Queer in AI, I would say that's a fairly large part. It's pretty important to me, I would say, like that, and like, the LGBT networks on Twitter. I know it sounds kind of trivial, but it's that sort of thing that keeps me from like it, like more than anything, it like reaffirms that like my experiences are like not just something I'm making up. I've had people try to tell me that like, that like I'm inventing like oppression or something like that. And the online communities really just do help like reaffirm that I'm not crazy. This is actually like a difficult thing, and yeah, kind of sanity checks. Yeah.
Yeah, I already kind of touched upon this a little bit. I think my primary support has been through Queer in AI. I want to give a shout out to Luca Soldaini, amazing person. If you ever meet him, uh, like he really helped me get involved in that organization, and he's been like helping me step through everything again from grad school apps to internships, and it's just been really amazing. I guess like in terms of my lab, I also have to say that I'm really lucky that my PI is a woman. I think that really makes a big difference because obviously none of our experiences are monolithic. Like everyone has very intersectional individual experiences, but she really affirms that there is value to diversity and inclusion and including everyone's perspectives regularly. And that means something to me. Oftentimes when I'm doing research, like there are people in the lab who will make it seem like you're wasting your time doing diversity work, that you're wasting your time trying to find a community because they don't really feel the need to have a community because everything is their community. Like they are the default, they are the norm. But it's really nice to have someone who like, supports you in that sense too.
So I guess my experiences are a little different from what Mary Lena and Arjun spoke about, partly because I think there's a bit of a generational gap as well. For example, I'm perhaps the only queer person in the professoriate in the School of Engineering here at NYU, which is a relatively, a school in a relatively liberal city. And I think part of what we need to address going forward is queer representation, going through the ranks from undergraduate students in computer science to graduate study to going on to become academics or going on to become researchers or in industry, right? So I think the support systems, unfortunately, as a professor in my department, are non-existent. I'm pretty much the only queer person. So what I've done is try to find allies who understand the challenges of being, a minority community. And so, for example, that would be the women in my department. We've been trying very hard to, for example, work on IDBE efforts. And, it's a little bit of a generational struggle. There are people in my department who grew up in a generation, professors who grew up in a generation, not only in the US, but back in India or from China or various parts of the world, where being gay or queer was just not was not acceptable, right? Like they grew up potentially in fairly homophobic backgrounds, and so to fight against the resistance of the fight to kind of increase, for example, diversity at all ranks can be a bit of a challenge, and can be a little bit of an upward struggle sometimes. But I do find allies amongst women and people of color in my department, and we've been trying to put up a increasingly united front. And so, I'm really hopeful to see more diversity going forward, going from undergraduate programs to grad schools all the way to academia, and that would be fantastic.
Yeah, it definitely is frustrating how long it takes changes to trickle all the way like up hierarchies and up through generations. But it is really great to hear that you're hopeful and that things are slowly changing. So our next question is about the hardest part about being queer in tech. Have you ever encountered a coworker or a peer who's not supportive? And how did you get through that? And the order for this question is going to be Arjun, and then Siddharth, and then Mary Lena.
Okay. Excuse the parakeets chirping really loudly in the background, but I have to say that I'm pretty fortunate, I guess. I haven't really been in a situation where people are explicitly or like overtly homophobic in any way. Like, I work primarily at startups and like research labs. I mean, usually big tech corporations are like fairly accepting. But there are people, again, who do think that like being queer is like something you happen to be while being in tech or while you're a researcher. And so, I mean, you might not feel on the level of individual interactions that being too damaging or detrimental, but it causes there to be systemic issues, right? Like when you don't support people who have been marginalized for so long because you think that it's just peripheral to their like work, that can lead to issues. I'm not going to go into like systemic issues right now, but yeah, I've been very fortunate to not have any overt like homophobic interactions.
I would echo that. I don't think I've had overt homophobic interactions. But I will also say, I think Marilena was saying this, it's partly because we tend to fly under the radar a little bit. At least I do at work, right? I would, to anybody who asks, I would discuss my sexuality, but I don't make a point of it. And I wonder if I were more overt about standing up, or not standing up, actually, let me say that differently, overt about talking about my orientation as frequently as my colleagues talk about their personal lives, I wonder what the responses would be. And again, I don't think that anyone will ever say anything overtly homophobic, but I do wonder sometimes if for example, they'd be less likely to collaborate with me. But I think the one instance of, I guess, homophobia not directed personally at me has been this resistance that I've found to trying to get more queer youth involved in computer science. And so a few years back, I was writing my NSF career proposal, which is like a very big step in the journey for an academic in computer science. And one big component of an NSF career proposal is talking about outreach efforts. And you get to kind of talk about the things you care about the most. And at that point, I was proposing to set up a pipeline with the Harvey Milk High School, which is high school that kind of provides a safe space for queer youth in New York City, and trying to build programs talking about cybersecurity and machine learning. And I remember talking to senior faculty about my plans and somebody pointing out, well, queer people are only a very small fraction of the US population. So, these are called broader impact efforts. And he said, well, I don't think your impact is going to be particularly broad. So I think, that is something which I feel is still a sentiment that is shared by too many people, where, efforts for outreach. And I don't think this stops any of us from doing this work, but, you do face resistance sometimes. And I think, some of that resistance comes from places of bias, right? Perhaps, harkening back to the systemic biases that were mentioned previously. But personally, no, I don't think I've been ever the target of any homophobia.
Yeah, I guess for me, the first part of my response is very, very similar to what was just said, where like I don't talk about it a lot. Like I don't like if it explicitly comes up, I'm not going to hide it, but I don't bring up the topic. I don't, I try to be low key about it for the most part. For me, I guess the hardest part is, so I mentioned I grew up, hearing that like gay people were going to hell and were evil and trying to kill Christians and things like that. And so for me, I also like, you grew up hearing like the F slur thrown around and people use gay as an insult. All of these things are just very like, they were routine for me. And so for me, like people don't, like, of course, this sort of thing doesn't really happen in the workplace because it's not professional, but I don't know. The thing for me is like, I don't know how many of these people think these things and say these things in their free time. Like, I don't know, like, as was mentioned before too, like, I think Siddharth is the second queer professor I have ever met in my entire career. And so I don't know how many of my superiors like have these sorts of ideas, and I don't know what the repercussions are going to be if I ever say something about it. I did, like, I suppose in terms of like explicitly homophobic things, I did once have a colleague from my PhD program tell me that the LGBT community and diversity efforts were oppressive to straight people, and we enjoyed privileges that straight people didn't have. So that's probably the only, I guess even that is kind of indirect, but that's the first thing that comes to mind, I suppose. The other thing, the other thing that I notice all the time is, so my PhD, I do like AI and medical physics research, but my PhD program is in statistics, right? And so one thing I see all the time is people dichotomizing by gender. And not to say that that's like not a thing that like you can do in data science, because obviously in many cases it makes sense to do that. But I remember this one time, as a counterexample of something really good that happened, is at a statistics seminar, someone was presenting analyses stratified into male and female categories, and they referred to it as dichotomized gender. And that, to me, that was like a breath of fresh air. Like it was amazing, like how much that it really did to make me feel like a lot more seen, I guess. But that's something that happens like very, very frequently that I think nobody thinks about. Like I had a professor just a couple weeks ago literally say the phrase, men don't have cervixes in class. So I guess I had forgotten about that. But yeah, I guess there's another experience that of homophobia you might document, but yeah, that's kind of my experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. The last question from me before I turn it over to Julia is, have you ever experienced imposter syndrome? And if so, how did you get through it? We're going to start with Siddharth, then Mary Lena, and then Arjun.
Yeah, I mean, I guess imposter syndrome is, some of it is perhaps related to queerness, and some of it is something that we all go through perhaps I will speak for myself actually, that I certainly have gone through, many, many times. And for me, the imposter syndrome is really, I think, related to growing up queer in India, where, I think Mary Lena was saying that in Canada, people said queer people go to hell. In India, people don't even acknowledge the existence of queer people, right? It's not even a thing, right? It's a Western disease or whatever, right? If it ever comes up. And so I knew from a young age that I was gay, but I had to, at the same time, right, to deal with all of the guilt and all of the sentiments that come along with growing up gay in a country where it's not even ever discussed. I felt that I made choices, right? Like I felt less able to pursue, in retrospect, what might have been, I felt, for example, perhaps I would have been able to find my way into doing research, engineering research that has more direct human impact at an earlier stage than I did in my career, right? And that's maybe not as much imposter syndrome, but I always felt that I'm not being true to myself, right? I used to love doing computer engineering and computer hardware design, but I also felt internally that somehow I'm not being completely true to myself. And at the same time, because you feel that if you try to kind of deviate from the straight and narrow, no pun intended, right, that you'll be outed. I wasn't out in grad school. You feel somehow constrained, right, into doing things that are very traditional because you have this other aspect of you that you don't want other people to find out about. So maybe that's kind of unique to my experiences, kind of growing up queer in India, where I wasn't out till a much later time. That I'm pretty sure Mary Lena and Arjun have somewhat different takes on this.
Yeah, I guess that makes a lot of sense. And I guess I have a sort of a little bit of similar take, I guess. My experience, yes, was different, I suppose. What was I gonna say? Sorry, could you repeat the actual question once more for me? I was totally forgot what the actual prompt was when I was listening.
Yeah, of course. The question is, have you ever experienced imposter syndrome? And if so, how did you get through it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So my background, I mentioned I was in music for a while, and so this was what I was supposed to do. It's what my parents wanted me to do. So growing up, like they were very like explicit. My parents like didn't think I was smart enough to go into science, and I don't know how much of that was related to sexuality and stuff. But there was a point like junior year where, like I mentioned, I was trying to do everything right. I was a nun candidate. Like I was trying to follow all the rules, do everything perfectly. And there was a point where I realized I couldn't keep up the facade. Like there was this sort of person I was trying to be, and like these interests that I was trying to have to be like, feminine and be like a good like woman, right? It just wasn't sustainable. And so when that started breaking down, I started coming out, and I also switched into science. And so for me, I always feel like, for me, the entire science career, because this was my junior year of college, felt like it's one big game of playing catch up, where I'm always like, I'm years behind. I did the statistics degree in 3 semesters, and I felt like I was like, treading water, trying to get through all this material. But what gets me through it every time is spite. I think about all the things that I was told, and I'm like, they tried to keep me out, but they couldn't do it. I'm not gonna back down. Like I just makes me angry. I'm like, I gotta do this. Like, of course I have to do this now. Like now, yeah, I guess, yeah. So pure unbridled rage is my counter to imposter syndrome.
Yeah, spite is so motivating. Honestly, one of the biggest motivators. I guess like in terms of my personal experiences, I guess I have a kind of different answer. Just again, maybe it's the generational thing and like the fact that I go to UCLA and it's been really easy to just be open. I feel like I have, dealt with a lot of imposter syndrome, but it's almost like being queer as like a superpower that's helped me like kind of see past that. Like I think like, oh, sometimes, for example, like if I'm doing research, I have to work twice as hard because innately I will never be able to output research like everyone else is. And then when I end up outputting research or making like these scientific discoveries, I'm like, that wasn't because of me. That was because I worked really hard. So that means I need to work even harder next time. And that's just kind of the mindset I have with research, a lot of times with school. And it's like this vicious cycle. It's very frustrating. But I guess from the perspective of being queer, like maybe with the fairness work, I see people dichotomizing gender constantly. And I'm like, wow, you are really leaving out a pretty good chunk of the population that does not identify within the gender binary. And the reason I care so much about that, and I can see that's such an issue, is because I identify as non-binary. And like on top of that, I know that even if you try to model non-binary identities, you'll do a like fucking terrible job with it because there's no way to do that. It's like we're literally defining non-binary with respect to the binary to begin with, and like it's going to end up being this exnomination of like androgynous white people as like what you think is non-binary, and it's kind of a rant. But I think that being queer is almost a superpower when you have the ability to be open and look at all these human-centered AI systems impacting queer and trans people. And I'm like, that's something that I can do. That's something I innately can do. I have that perspective and I don't need to work super, super hard to like achieve that. That's something that I bring to the table that not a lot of other people can.
Superpower. I love that. Oh, y'all are so inspiring. Okay, cool. So switching gears a little bit, the next question is, how has your identity influenced your career path? So for this order, we'll go Arjun, then Siddharth, and then Marilena.
Gotta catch my breath now. But like I guess in terms of career path, I think like this is something very similar to what Sid said about like being true to yourself. Like I really do value creating technology that positively impacts humans, and maybe even more so right now, reforming technology so that it's not hurting humans, like segments of our population. So I want to do a lot of that. I do want to be able to do that, but I also really do love more theoretical work when it comes to like graph representation learning. Like one thing that I really find interesting is the expressivity of graph neural networks. There are certain tasks which graph neural networks cannot learn to perform, regardless of how deep they are or how many layers, I guess like how many layers you put in there, or like if you just use message passing, you won't be able to achieve these tasks. So I always try to look for ways to intersect like graph work and some of this fairness work, right? So like if I want to incorporate fairness in graphs into a research project, I'm going to be looking for ways to maybe learn fair embeddings of nodes without demographics, so that we're respecting people's privacy while making sure that the like worst harm that could be done to any group is minimized. Maybe in addition to that, I see that graphs are being used in social networks all over the place, like social media sites like Facebook. What exactly is being learned by these sites? What information are they collecting? How is that information propagated between different users based on like followee status? I don't know, I'm just kind of like rambling at this point, but I'm always trying to look for intersections. I always want to be true to myself while kind of also focusing on like this graph stuff that I'm very interested in. And I hope to do a lot of that during my PhD. That'd be really cool.
So yeah, just to follow up on that, I think, I guess I said this before as well. I think, the first part of my career was spent, I wasn't out, and I think I was trying as hard as I can to not do things that would make it clear that, I'm gay, for example. So I did a lot of really intensely mathematical work in that part of my career, and I loved it. But, would I have done that if I were out? Maybe not. And so when I think looking back at the research that I've pursued, I've moved around a lot in terms of research domains, from computer engineering to security, and now I'm looking at AI and security intersections and fairness and bias. And in addition, I do side projects in information theory and a bunch of other topics. And I was at some point, somebody asked me, why is it like, a lot of people think of the academic model as being really deep in one domain, right? You spend your entire career studying this one topic and becoming the world's expert on that topic. And somebody asked me, well, that's kind of interesting. I was going up for tenure actually, and someone who was evaluating my case said, well, I mean, what I see is just really kind of a lack of focus in some sense, right? You're just doing a lot of different things. And I feel like, a lot of that movement, a lot of that trying out various things was essentially trying to find my identity through my research. And I think, again, if, this generation, that Arjun, I think it's different because it's fantastic that people are now able to be so comfortable with their identity. But it just took my generation more time to get there, right? And I think that has just kind of mirrored in my work. And now I'm out, and and I think that's mirrored in my work as well, where suddenly I'm a lot more comfortable working on topics related to AI bias and fairness. I'm a lot more comfortable, going and speaking to my colleagues in, public health or the social sciences and talking to them about what aspects of computer science might be interesting to them, which is sometimes it's, surprising to my peers. Like, why are you going talking to somebody in gender studies, right? What can they say about computer science and engineering? And I think, yeah, so in terms of how my queerness is affected or impacted or is mirrored in my career, I think it's actually like every step has been mirrored in some sense in the work that I've done.
Man, what you just said about searching for identity in like research topics, that hit me really hard. Like, I had never thought of that before, but like I totally resonate with that. That's really cool to hear. For me, I guess, so yeah, thank you. But for me, I guess a lot of my, like I mentioned before, my I was trying to be, a lot of my sexuality and such are innately tied into my career choices, in as much as like, trying to do what I'm supposed to do rather than what I really want to do, and that sort of thing. But also, like, now I see it affecting my work in a different way now, right? So I always had this idea that, like, if I was good enough, like I felt like, if maybe once I'm good enough and I've proven myself to my advisor, I've proven myself to my department, then I can come out, right? And so I feel like as a result of like having to switch fields so quickly in order to graduate on time and stuff, like, one thing I did develop is this sort of idea that I have to do everything like alone and independent. Like, I can't ask for help, otherwise they'll know that I'm behind. I remember this one time I was talking to a professor about getting into a class that I was wanting to waive a prerequisite for, and they asked me, well, why are you a junior and taking Calc 1? And like, I had to kind of stand there and kind of make up some reason other than, major life changes. But I still see that now today. Like, I feel like I don't, it's been like, I'm trying to find the balance of like asking for help when necessary, but not excessively. And so, but I do have this tendency to try to like take control and like come up with my own ideas instead of like asking, for my advisor's input, and like, want to solve all the problems before I go to the meeting. which in some ways it's good because it makes me think about the project and try to find my own solutions, but in other ways it can make you sit there and spin your wheels for a long time. So that's kind of, that's been my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I love the point about, finding your identity and also like, reminding yourself that you're not in this alone. And that segues really nicely to our second to last question here. So the question is, what can we as students do to make AI a little more inclusive? So the order for this will be Siddharth, Marilena, and then Arjun.
So I guess one thing, and I'll maybe kind of talk a little bit about a personal story and then maybe relate that to what students can do. I think, we have to make people uncomfortable for them to change, right? And we can do that in small ways and big ways. And so, for example, in my department, we were tasked with creating a diversity statement, right? Which a lot of departments and schools are doing. And it ends up being pablum for the most part, right? It ends up being a bunch of people who don't really care, who write some uninspiring. And so, I said, look, I don't want to see uninspiring pablum on our website, right? So what I'd like to do is to have a diversity statement that starts by apologizing for the harms that were done over the last several decades in computer science and engineering. And I would like for the department to vote on that. And it suddenly forces people to come out of the woodwork, right? To basically verbalize that, oh, I'm not comfortable voting for that. And then you can say, well, why not though? Because I think everybody can agree superficially that diversity matters, that creating safe spaces matter. And then the moment you have to put resources and time and effort and money and all of these things, I think that's when it gets challenging. So I would love to see undergraduates and grad students make your professors uncomfortable, make your dean uncomfortable about these issues, right? I mean, you will find that if you go and talk to your dean or your department chair, they will gladly sign on to just like a statement, right? But what about where's the actual commitment? So I would say, you guys, all of you are the people that deans care the most about and department chairs care the most about, and you have the power to make your department chairs and your deans uncomfortable about the state of affairs. So, I would say, hold their feet to the fire, and I think you can do that better than I can do that because I report to them, right? So they can, they have, but you are paying undergrads, or you're in some sense, quote unquote, the customer. Although I hate thinking about education in those terms, right? But you have the power to hold them accountable for addressing some of these historic inequities.
Is it me next?
Yep.
Okay. So I guess I've kind of already mentioned one of mine. I like the whole dichotomizing by gender thing is a very specific thing that is a common trope that I feel like has a very simple fix where you refer to it as dichotomized gender instead of just gender, and then, yeah, of course there are like structural issues as well, but I'm gonna be honest, I don't have a ton of answers for that because I guess I'm still just like, I'm a grad student. These are still things I've been thinking about, and I don't know fully what the solution is, but I definitely agree with everything that was just said. We have to make people uncomfortable in order for any change to take place. And it's also nice to see, like, for me at least, it's nice to see people who aren't LGBT kind of speaking out about that sort of thing as well, because then it's not just, LGBT people, because often there's like backlash. If you try to make people uncomfortable, then they push you away. So when people who are not part of the community stand up and do these things as well, I feel like it's like almost more effective because there's more, because society puts a greater emphasis on their voices.
So I guess like anyone who already knows me knows that I have a lot to say about making AI more inclusive. But I really do think the way I view the like diversity and exclusion issues in AI it's like it revolves around like a pipeline. Like basically from elementary school, we are already filtering out people who would be great AI researchers and scientists. And ultimately, like I don't want to treat AI because it's ultimately algorithms, right? It's not like we're actually creating artificial intelligence, or at least we're nowhere close to that. But all these algorithms operate in the likeness of their creators. They encode the biases of their creators, and those creators are usually like white, able-bodied, cis, straight men. So it'd be nice to get more people in those roles. But by the time you as like a student come to college, you've already chosen your major, right? So like that already puts you on a different path potentially from going into a career in AI. You might end up not going to a PhD program because there's so many barriers in accessing that. Even before college, high school, like there are going to be counselors and teachers who say that you're not cut out for STEM. That'll actually take place in middle school as well. So some of the work that AI outreach does at UCLA is going out to underserved high schools and like really making sure that we get students excited about literally anything related to STEM, because they will find their way. It may not be AI, but we just want to get them excited, passionate. They don't have to understand the stuff we're talking about, but if they see things that capture their interest, hopefully that interest like persists for as many years as is needed for them to go into that PhD program and make a difference. And I think with regards to like LGBTQIA plus specific issues, the reason we organize Queer Hacks is because I think it's very much a visibility problem. There are tons of queer and trans, amazing queer and trans computer scientists here, but there's no like forum for their voices to be heard. And like Mary Elena said, their voices are often excluded because we just don't put as much emphasis on their voices. So Queer Hacks gives them a space to, like through the development of products, essentially express how they're feeling about society, how they're like, how they, I guess like how do they feel with regards to like their current position within their department? Like, do they feel imposter syndrome, like they're the result of systemic issues? Do they feel excluded because of either overt homophobia or systemic homophobia, etc.? Like, it's just a really nice place for people to be creative. The last thing I want to say about this is I think we need more constructivist approaches to education. And constructivist meaning like, I don't want like Eurocentric ethics thrown at me in my college classes. I think that in order for people with the voices, that again is white, able-bodied, cis, straight men, to be able to speak on the behalf of like LGBTQIA plus, like Black and Indigenous individuals, they need non-Eurocentric ethics. And they need to be quiet, and they need to hear the perspectives of LGBTQIA plus Black and Indigenous people. Like, we need to have conversations. We don't want to be lectured at. We want people to tell us about their experiences growing up. Like, we need to really also have people evaluate their positionality. So like what makes you successful in society? Who is defining success? Are you part of the group that defines success? Are you benefiting from that? I think that those are all really important questions for us to evaluate as a whole, and hopefully that creates a more aware workforce and research community in the future.
Definitely awesome. Those are all really good points for all of us to keep in mind. Cool. So now we just have one final short question before we open up to the audience. So for our panelists here, do you guys have any final words or advice you'd give to someone who would like to follow in your footsteps? So maybe someone who identifies as queer and also would like to enter the AI field. And, oh, sorry, the order for this would be Arjun, Siddharth, and Mary Elena.
So I feel like it's kind of pompous of me to like give advice because I'm ultimately just graduating from my undergraduate program. But there is some advice I'd like to give, which is like basically like look for the community. We're like all the communities that exist out there, like Queer in AI, for example. We are trying our best to reach out and have undergraduate mentoring programs, make sure that undergraduates feel especially gender nonconforming undergraduates feel comfortable going into labs and doing research so that they can then access grad school. But we can't reach everyone. It's really hard, and we're making very incremental progress. So I promise you, please reach out to any of us and we will open our arms out. We'll bring you in non-COVID times, give you a hug, and then help you out with anything you need. I think the other panelists here can agree that if you meet another queer person, especially someone who's younger than you and they want mentoring, I will drop everything and honestly give them as many hours as they need to feel better about themselves, because that's just so important to all of us here. We really want to support you. So again, find the community, find mentors, and you don't need to be worried about taking up our time or anything. That's not really an issue. We want to make sure that you're successful.
So maybe I'll speak briefly to, career paths after graduate school, right? And what I want to say is, I think Marilena mentioned that, I didn't know any professors in computer science who were gay when I got my PhD, right? It was just, I didn't think at that time that there were gay computer scientists. And, I think most importantly, know that there are actually, in reality, there's a project, for example, 500 queer scientists. Increasingly people are feeling more free to express themselves. And I think, know that you're not alone. And, we need academia, especially industry as well, of course, but academia especially needs your skill and talent, and most importantly, your perspective, right? Because as Arjun was pointing out, AI is really designed in the image of its maker, right? And so if the makers come from only one particular group, then the AI is going to also suffer the consequences of that normativity, right? And so we really, really need your talents and your perspectives. And so, especially when it comes to either applying for grad school or applying for faculty positions afterwards, there's so many resources, both for people in general, but also for people of queer individuals. So reach out to me, reach out to other people that in the community. And as Arjun said, I think certainly it's been my personal experience, but mentoring is perhaps the most important thing that many of us do, right? And so again, that would be my top priority over pretty much anything else I can spend my time on. So yeah, you don't be shy to reach out for help.
Yeah, I definitely all agree with everything that has been just said. I guess the one thing that was a big thing for me to learn is that people aren't going to change and help you because you're nice. One of the things that was big for me to learn is that I need to make people respect me, not to make them like me. And if I want people to take my work seriously, I have to command that sort of respect and stuff like that. So not being afraid to take up space, I guess, is the lesson there. I used to think if I just said the least amount of words possible, just kept my head down and my grades high, never bother your professors, sort of just be good, then this is the way, then people would notice noticed your dedication, the fact that you weren't bothering them. But when in reality, no, that's not how it works. Everybody is too busy to really care about that sort of thing. So if you need disability accommodations or something like that, if you need anything, you have to go out and take it and actually fight for it. I remember, yeah, this is kind of, I have a little bit of experience with this because I also have, I'm also disabled. I have epilepsy, but this sort of thing I think applies to many different, it's an intersectional thing as well.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. So those are all the questions that we have prepared. We would like to, at this time, open it up to the audience. Please keep in mind that we are recording, so if you'd rather maybe not be recorded, feel free to use the chat, and then either Nisha or I can read out your question to the panelists. But also feel free to either raise your hand or unmute yourself if you have a question you'd like to ask yourself. All right. I'll make sure I can see everything okay. Give it a
I
second.
don't think it has to be anything related to like being LGBTQIA plus in AI. We have a professor, a PhD student, and an undergraduate here. So I think like you have a pretty good like diverse set of perspectives that you can probably ask about anything related to AI.
Also, feel free to send me or Julia like a private message if you don't want it going to everyone.
Well, I have a very unrelated question, but just like on the topic of like, quarantine and all, what has been your guys' like go-to quarantine activity these past like many months? Feel free to just like jump in any order.
So I was interning at a company last summer, and during one of our meetings, I just heard like someone playing a ukulele, and I was like, "Whoa, that's so cool! Like, is that you?" And she was like, "Yeah, I'm playing a ukulele. It's really fun. I just got into it during the quarantine." And then literally, I ordered a ukulele that night, and I've been getting really into the ukulele. It's very relaxing, and I guess like I love playing music, so it's been really nice to have that as something that is a distractor from stressors in my life.
This is cliche, but I've been making bread. I was not a cook at all before the pandemic started, and this has forced me to learn to like up my cooking game. And then like bread is the most, I think, several people have had this experience. It's the most incredibly relaxing thing. So yeah, spending a lot of time on bread.
I guess for me, like I was always kind of like an introvert, and I didn't really have like a huge, I didn't really go out all that much to begin with, but I guess I've mostly just been amping up the things that I've already done, sort of had as hobbies. So I like listening to heavy metal. So that's always a go-to. The one thing I do miss going to live concerts though. And the and the other thing, of course, is playing video games. I really like RPGs, so I've been playing a bunch of those.
Classic. Awesome. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of video gaming and cooking myself, so it's definitely been a time to like do all the things that I spent so much time on in high school when I've just been at home. Right. So let me check the chat. I want to make sure I'm not missing anyone if they're like raising hands, but yeah. So if
I actually have a quick question, like before wrapping up.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my question and a partial suggestion. So a lot of people have talked about making people uncomfortable and like having more visibility and so on. And my question is like, as this queer in AI group, what can we do, like, in conferences and in our workplaces to, for those of us like who are out, to increase the visibility and make academia and industry in tech, in AI more accepting for people. And I think one of those suggestions that I have is that maybe we can propose in the AI conferences like ICML or NeurIPS and so on, if they can have like a theme of like, like maybe let's say the LGBT theme or Black Lives Matter theme or something like that, where we are not just picking up, like if we can have Google and Uber and these kind of corporates as sponsors, why can't we have like, these social justice themes, which can give visibility to these issues that matter to everyone. So it's not just like, few bunch of like queer people in a room just talking about these things, but maybe everybody can just wear a rainbow, like as a solidarity towards the cause. So maybe like more of such ideas on how to make these conferences and push our homo agenda, so to speak, like, in the conferences and in the tech.
That's awesome. Wait, I'm actually gonna I wrote that down and everything. I feel like, during the next organizer meeting, I'll definitely bring that up. Right now, we're trying to form better alliances with all the other affinity groups. So queer in AI, Black in AI, Latinx in AI. And together, we actually have a lot of power because they're not paying us to do our diversity work, but they still like desperately need us. So we have a lot of say in like the themes of these of these conferences. So I'll 100% bring that up. Thank you for the suggestion. I guess like with regards to actually improving that within the conferences themselves, I don't know. It's really tough. I think we often take a look inwards often rather than look outwards. Like we're not looking for cishet people to understand like the marginalization of the LGBTQIA plus community within AI. We often look to see which subgroups within our community are most misrepresented or impacted. So like for IC, I'm organizing the ICML workshop right now, and we are doing, we're focusing on like non-cis identities within non-Western cultures, which is very much neglected because a lot of the terminology within LGBTQIA plus community is very Western centric. So that's, we probably should also take a look outward.
Cool. There is one question in the chat specifically for Mary Lana. And the question is, has your study in the cello major affected your work today?
That's an interesting question. That's a thing I think about sometimes, and I think the answer is yes, it does. So I recently did my went through my PhD qualifying exams, and one piece of positive feedback I did get on my qual was that my research ideas for novel directions were creative, and that to me, for me, like I made a sappy Twitter post about it, but like I like to think that that sort of thing is my cello major paying off in some regard. And I will say that the music and music theory, like my first published paper was in music theory, right? And I will say that and mathematics and AI are not so different as people commonly think. So the same creative problem solving process that is required to create a working AI system is this, it's exactly the same as the creative problem solving process necessary to work out some particularly difficult passage on, you know, in a piece or something like that. So that, I think that, along with, you know, just general applicable lessons about practicing inordinate amounts of time a day and stuff like that, that's also very transferable. But I think it definitely, I like to think it gives me a unique perspective and a unique, you know, angle at solving problems.
That is super cool. There's another question that came in from a DM. I'm curious if the panelists have any advice on how to affect change in a CS department as an undergraduate. I was pretty disheartened after town hall yesterday and the department's responses to questions about LGBTQ support. And for context, for anyone who wasn't there, basically there was the one comment made about how being LGBTQ+ was a lifestyle choice, and then there were really no concrete suggestions for how to support those students.
Yeah, I think, I mean, having tried to bring up some of these issues in my own department, it can be challenging. I think, you know, if you look at again, this is, some of it comes down to a generational gap. The people who hold the power come from generations where they didn't necessarily think that, you know, being from any minority background was challenging. And I think, you know, again, I think students have to realize that they hold out all the power, right? I mean, universities would be nothing without their students. And so, right, I mean, some of it involves, as I was saying, making leadership uncomfortable. And, you know, some of it is hard work, but involves like, you know, groups like Queer and AI in the AI, but hopefully there's also queer groups at UCLA who can talk to the dean and emphasize the deep issues with the kinds of comments that were made in your meeting and how little support structures there are for LGBTQ, right? I think, at least in my experience, leadership is more likely to respond to students than they are to faculty members raising these issues. So I would say just, you know, recognize your power actually, right? Students have a lot of power in affecting change at universities.
Definitely. Cool. So there's another question in the chat. Has anyone had any experience working in industry? If so, were those companies inclusive? Did they have any diversity, equality, inclusion initiatives that stood out? So yeah, again, this question is specifically for industry, if anyone has any experience there.
I have a very small amount of industry experience, I guess. I had one internship with a tech company, but unfortunately, that job was nice because my superior, my boss, was a woman, so that was pretty cool. But I never really, because it was only an internship, I never really investigated the DEI. If they did have it, it wasn't prominent enough that I would know about it. And also, I guess at that point, I wasn't super, I guess I'm still not super, out there about all of this stuff. So from what I knew of it, it was a supportive community. But
unless anyone else wants to respond to that, we do have another question in the chat. I'm curious about how conferences in CS and AI are willing to engage with the issues around names for trans people. I've often felt a hesitation around public-facing research that emanates from my worries around committing too heavily into my pre-transition name and identity committing too heavily to my pre-transition name and identity into my professional network.
I want to say, first of all, I'm so sorry, and it's like I don't want to be the bearer of bad news necessarily, but we still have quite a bit of way to go with regards to name change policies in most research forums. So the bad news is that there's still tons of issues, and the majority of people are hosting sites like Google Scholar and who are doing reviews and editorial work for ACL, for example. They're not doing the best job of integrating name changes, but there's probably one of the strongest efforts within AI and ML to actually have those name change policies enforced. So Google Scholar is, again, not great with this. ACL recently had an issue where you are not allowed to post preprints of your work within a certain period of submission to the conference, and that caused issues for works where they refer to researchers by their dead name. They don't have the opportunity to correct that. But there's this amazing person, I believe, I don't want to mispronounce their name, but it's Jasmine Bastings, who's also part of Queer and AI, and they're leading this very strong effort into they wrote a letter, an open letter to get ACL to change that policy. Irving Redding is another great person to look into. They've done awesome work across a bunch of different scientific journals to have more inclusive name change policies. There are many talks on this too. I don't know if you go to UCLA, but QT STEM, which is an organization we have on campus, is very focused on this issue. So I highly encourage reaching out to them and seeing if they have any issues or talks, or sorry, any discussions or talks on this issue.
Cool. So I think those are the questions that we have in the chat. I think, yeah. So if anyone has any other questions, I believe we will still be able to stick around here until around 7:30, but I just wanted to wrap up this recording. A huge thank you to our three panelists for sharing their story and sharing their advice. Super empowering to hear. So again, now we're just going to go into an informal sort of chat session, and this will not be recorded.